And now for our feature presentation.
And welcome back to 2.3. Let's tour the graph editor a little bit more and finish the squash and stretch on our bouncing ball cycle. So obviously, on impact here, we need to start seeing some squash frames. We're going to assume this is our last stretch frame, and let's hit the squash pretty hard right on the next frame. So we'll go to frame 32, and let's look at our scale keys. So obviously, we want to go inverse on the scale Z and squash this. So let's go 0.8, squash him down. Now we need to compensate in the other two for volume maintenance again. So if we want these to equal 3, these are going to be 1.1 a piece. I'm going to hit insert keyframes to make sure that's there, and I'm going to turn auto key on, so we'll have it to continue working henceforth. So we also want a pretty harsh squash frame before the ball takes off again, and our cycle finishes at frame 36. We'll go back and see what our value was on that initial squash, so that's 1.1 and 0.8. So let's hit this even a little bit harder and squash our scale Z down to 0.7 and compensate for volume by making these two, and we can highlight those fields simultaneously, to 1.15, equaling once again a total of positive 3. Now I've made a minor error here. When I go back to my graph editor, I accidentally overwrote the keys for the last frame of my cycle with my new squash frames. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to deselect, reselect these guys. These were supposed to be at the frame previous, so I'm going to go GX minus 1, pop them back. I'm going to re-replicate the frames that I know that need to be there from the head of my cycle. So I'm going to deselect A, because all selections in Blender are additive in the graph editor. I'm going to hit Shift D, G, X, and move those over again to the end of the cycle. And A, once again, to deselect. So let's hit Alt A for playback and see what kind of pattern we're getting. Not bad, a perfectly acceptable squishy ball, but I think we could go in and exaggerate it a little bit more before we're finished with it. So we'll stop playback and analyze some of those squash and stretch frames a little bit more closely. So I'm going to zoom in to that portion of the graph editor. Now another tool that we can look at quickly here is you'll see that once we've zoomed in, we can no longer see the arc of our translates. So we could either zoom back out, then we lose detail of the view of the scale keys. We can hit the normalize checkbox, zoom in again. What that does is crushes the display of all of the animation curves between +1 and -1, no matter what their actual value is. If I select this key, you'll see it appears to be at 1.0. Its actual value is 1.2. And if we look at one of the translate Z's, that has an actual value of 5, but its display is just crushed. Now, another thing that you want to be aware of if you're working with normalize is, I'm going to make a quick little change to this key. I'm just going to hit GY, move it down a little bit, and then hit the left mouse button to confirm the move. It appears to have popped back up to its prior location. In fact, it hasn't. Its value is less, now at 3.294, but it's redrawn the curve to keep the ceiling at 1.0. That can get a little bit confusing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to undo that move, and what I'm going to do is turn off the auto redraw of the normalize. I'll show you what that means. I'll quite simply move this again without the redraw on, confirm the move. It's now at a lower value, 3.46, but it has not redrawn the curve. So the proportion of that move is now visually reflected inside the normalization floor and ceiling. If that sounds a little overly complicated, just turn auto reframe off when you don't want it redrawing your keys when you think you just put them somewhere. Anyway, let's go back to our squash and stretch keys and we'll just revert back to the prior view. So here we are back on our normal view again, and our curves are not normalized. This is their standardized display. I'm not that concerned with the translate Z at the moment. We were talking about adjusting the squash and stretch frames, so we'll zoom in. And what I'm principally interested in is just making the squash portion of this a little bit more dynamic. And there's a couple of things that I'd like to do. This should be very simple. Our first squash happens after impact here at frame 32. Then it's got a little room to squash a bit more to 36. I would like to make that a touch more dramatic. Right now, the scales are at 1.15 and 7. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to reduce the Z to 0.65 squish it down a little bit more, and then we want to compensate in X and Y a little bit for volume maintenance, but I'm going to enter 1.3. That actually exceeds the original volume of the sphere, but I feel that makes our squash look a little bit more like it's going to burst out of that squash if we add a little bit of volume back in. So we'll just scrub that a little bit. Now, I also want to show you a little scrubbing trick also, because right now I'm just dragging with the left mouse button in the timeline. What I can also do is just hold down the Alt key and scrub by using the middle mouse wheel. So it's kind of a nice interactive way to do that without having to flick your wrist around that much. So now I'm going to hit Home in the graph editor, review everything that we have, and I'm going to select all of our channels in the list so we can see all of the keys. And also what I would like to do is reduce the cycle length overall by 1 frame. And that's going to make this squashing portion in the middle even a little bit more tight. So I'm going to go A to deselect, make sure I'm working clean here. I'm going to select the keys at the end. I'm going to go GX -1. Those will pop back. Now my cycle ends at frame 36 instead of frame 37. Let's do playback. I'm going to hit Enter to make that take, hit playback, and we're relatively happy with that. So what we're going to do is proceed into the next unit, break out of this cycle, and have the cycle diminish to the ball settling to a stop. So that's onward to Graph Editor Chapter 2.4. Then we'll do a Chapter 2.5 summary of all the Graph Editor tools that we have learned up until this point. So, as always, in closing a session before you save, the smart thing to do is to deselect all of your keys in the Graph Editor and deselect any active objects so that when you reopen the file after saving, it will open clean with no surprises. See you again shortly.